Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. The bayou. Now that's a place where the water runs deep and the stories run even deeper. I remember this one particular time, a trip that started out like any other, but turned into something I'll never forget. The kind of memory that sticks with a man, shaping the way he sees the water and the things that live in it. It was early fall, the air thick and humming with the sound of cicadas, the kind of morning where the mist lingers on the water like a ghost reluctant to leave. I had set out before first light, my boat cutting through the stillness of the bayou, the only sound the steady chug of the motor and the occasional splash of something unseen slipping into the water. I had fished these waters for years, knew the turns of the channels like the lines on my own hands. But no matter how many times I came out here, the bayou always held a kind of mystery that kept a man on his toes. I had a feeling about that day, the kind of quiet sense that the water was ready to give something up if I was patient enough to take it. I found my spot, a little opening where the cypress trees leaned in close, their knotted roots stretching into the murky depths. Spanish moss draped down like nature's own curtains, shading the water from the climbing sun. I cut the engine, letting the boat drift, the silence wrapping around me like an old coat. I started out slow, casting my line, watching the bait disappear into the dark water. The bayou wasn't like the open sea. Out here, everything was slower, quieter, but no less dangerous. You learned to respect the things beneath the surface, things that had been here long before you and would be here long after. Gators watched from the banks, their eyes barely breaking the surface, patient as time itself. Snakes coiled in the trees, waiting for an unsuspecting meal to pass beneath them. And then there were the fish, big, strong, and mean, the kind that didn't come easy. That morning, it didn't take long before I felt the first tug. A sharp jerk, then a second, stronger than the first. I knew right away this was no ordinary fish. The pull had weight, the kind that spoke of something old and stubborn. I set the hook, bracing myself as the fight began. The line cut through the water, sending ripples out in every direction. My reel whined as the fish took off, dragging me into a battle that I hadn't quite been prepared for. Minutes passed, maybe more, the world shrinking down to just me, the rod, and whatever was on the other end of that line. I fought with everything I had, muscles straining, sweat beading on my forehead despite the coolness of the morning. The fish wasn't giving up, but neither was I. I could feel the strength in its movements, the determination. I respected it, even as I pulled against it, knowing that out here, every fight was a test. And then, just when I thought I had the upper hand, the fish changed tactics. It dove hard, pulling the line straight down, the kind of move that made my stomach drop. I held on, digging my feet into the bottom of the boat, my arms burning with the effort. I wasn't sure how much longer I could last, but I wasn't about to let this one get away. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw it. A massive shadow rising from the depths, breaking through the murky water with a force that took my breath away. A gar, and not just any gar. This was the biggest I had ever seen. Its body was long and armored, prehistoric in its design, its sharp teeth glistening in the weak morning light. It thrashed, trying one last time to break free, but I was ready. With one final pull, I brought it alongside the boat, staring into the wild, unblinking eyes of a creature that had probably been alive longer than I had. I took a moment to catch my breath, feeling the weight of the catch in my hands, the way its body pulsed with life and defiance. This wasn't just another fish. It was a reminder of why I did this, why I came out here time and time again, chasing something just beyond my reach. I let out a slow breath, knowing that this was a story I'd carry with me for the rest of my days. As I made my way back, the bayou stretched out ahead of me, just as mysterious and untamed as ever. The mist had lifted, the sun rising higher, casting long shadows across the water. I had won my fight that day, but I knew the bayou would always have more waiting for me. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and strength in my arms, I'd keep coming back, answering the call of the water. Y'all hang tight, I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. See, I've always been drawn to the legend of Old Man Tiber. Now, I'm not talking about a person. Old Man Tiber was the name local folk gave to this massive mythical catfish that supposedly lived in the darkest depths of the Mississippi River, way down south near the Louisiana border. Folks said he was bigger than a rowboat, with whiskers like mooring ropes and a temper to match. Most dismissed it as just a tall tale, something to scare kids away from the river's edge. But I always held a healthy dose of respect and a sliver of belief for the old legends. Back then I was younger, stronger, and a whole heap braver or maybe dumber, depending on how you look at it. I had this little 16-foot aluminum boat, the Salty Siren, I called her. She wasn't much to look at, but she was reliable, and she knew the river like the back of my hand. Me and that boat, we were partners. So the summer of '92 was especially hot and dry. The river was low, and the fish were sluggish. I was catching enough to keep my head above water, but nothing spectacular. But something was different that year. The old-timers, the ones who'd been fishing the Mississippi their whole lives, they were all talking about strange currents, unusually large disturbances in the water, and missing nets, sturdy, industrial-strength nets, ripped to shreds like confetti. Of course, the whisper of Old Man Tiber grew louder. Some claimed to have seen him, a fleeting glimpse of a dark, monstrous shape beneath the murky surface. I told myself it was just the heat playing tricks on their minds, but the seed of curiosity, that little fishing bug, had been planted. I decided I wanted to research. I took out my old maps, the ones my granddaddy used to have. They were filled with notes and marked locations of prime fishing spots. I scoured them, and the details that were drawn up matched all the old legends and sightings of Old Man Tiber, and discovered it all centered around a particularly deep bend in the river, known as the Devil's Elbow. The current there was treacherous, swirling around submerged trees and rock formations, creating a natural whirlpool. It had always been a dangerous spot, avoided by most fishermen. Of course, I was not most fishermen. For weeks I researched and read, and asked all the local fishermen and historians about the legends of Old Man Tiber. I spent days studying the currents, and mapping the underwater terrain with my old depth finder. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was something extraordinary lurking in those depths. Now, I'm not usually one for fancy equipment. I'm more of a hook, line, and sinker kind of guy. But if I was going after something legendary, I knew I needed to up my game. So I went down to Cletus's Bait and Tackle, the only decent shop for miles, and I told him my plan. Cletus, he was a grizzled old cuss with a walleye-shaped birthmark on his cheek and a permanent smell of catfish stingbait clinging to him. He listened to my story with a skeptical glint in his eye. "Old man Tiber, huh? You gone loco, Jerry? That's just a myth, a story to scare greenhorns." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm going to find out for myself." Cletus chuckled, a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper rubbing against wood. "Well, if you're dead set on it, I reckon I can help you out. But don't come crying to me when that monster rips your arms off." He sold me the heaviest duty rod and reel he had, the kind used for deep-sea fishing. The line was braided steel, thick enough to tow a car. He even threw in a special extra-large hook, one he swore was big enough to snag a small whale. For bait, I did some research. Some say that the old river monsters like the taste of bullhead catfish, and some say they like bluegill. I rigged my line up with a huge live bluegill, hooked right through the back, and added a massive weight to get it down to the bottom. The next morning, before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon, I loaded up the salty siren and headed towards the Devil's Elbow. The air was thick with humidity, and the mist hung low over the water, giving the river an eerie, almost primordial feel. As I approached the bend, I could feel the current tugging at the boat, a constant reminder of the power lurking beneath the surface. I found a relatively calm spot just outside the main whirlpool, anchored the boat as securely as I could, and dropped my line. The weight pulled the bait down quickly, disappearing into the murky depths. Then I waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the boat. Sweat dripped off my brow, stinging my eyes. I swigged sweet tea and battled mosquitoes, wondering if I was wasting my time. Maybe Cletus was right. Maybe old man Tiber was just a myth. Just as I was about to reel in my line and call it a day, something happened. The rod tip twitched, just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it happened again, a more pronounced tug. "It's on," I muttered, my voice trembling with excitement and a healthy dose of fear. I grabbed the rod, bracing myself. The line went taut, singing a high-pitched whine as something huge started pulling. This wasn't like any fish I'd ever caught before. It wasn't the sharp, erratic jerks of a bass or the steady pull of a gar. This was a slow, deliberate, unstoppable force. The boat lurched violently, nearly throwing me overboard. I gripped the sides, fighting to maintain my balance. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. I tightened the drag, but it barely slowed the beast down. "All right, you prehistoric son of a gun," I grunted, my muscles straining with the effort. "Let's see what you're made of." The battle was on. For what felt like an eternity, I fought that creature. It would pull, I would reel. It would dive, I would resist. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I refused to give up. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. This was about proving something to myself, about confronting the legend, about staring into the face of the unknown. The current was working against me, trying to drag the boat into the whirlpool. I fought to keep it pointed upstream, using the motor to compensate for the relentless pull. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the little boat into an oven. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to gain ground. The line tightened, the reel clattered, and I could feel the creature tiring. It wasn't giving up, but its movements were becoming less powerful, less deliberate. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally started to see something. A dark shape began to emerge from the depths, growing larger and larger as it neared the surface. My heart leaped into my throat. It was immense. I'm talking about a fish that dwarfed my boat. Its body was long and thick, covered in leathery, mottled brown skin. Its head was massive, with beady, ancient-looking eyes and a cavernous mouth that could swallow a basketball whole, and those whiskers. They were indeed like mooring ropes, thick and bristly, trailing in the water like seaweed. Old Man Tiber. He was real. I stared at him in awe and terror, a primal fear gripping me. This wasn't just a fish. It was a leviathan, a relic of a bygone era, a creature that had witnessed centuries of history unfold along the banks of the Mississippi. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, man and monster, separated by a thin line of braided steel. He looked at me with an ancient, unknowable gaze, his eyes reflecting the sunlight like polished obsidian. Then he made a move. With a sudden surge of power, he dove beneath the boat, pulling the line taut. The boat rocked violently, and I lost my footing, stumbling forward. In that moment of disarray, something snapped. Not the line, but something in me. I realized that I was in over my head. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a battle for survival. I reached for my knife, a trusty old Bowie that had been in my family for generations. With a deep breath, I sliced through the line. The sudden release of tension was almost deafening. The boat shuddered, then slowly righted itself. I watched as Old Man Tiber disappeared back into the depths, his massive form fading into the murky shadows. I sat there for a long time, panting, shaking, my body aching from the fight. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. I felt a mixture of relief, disappointment, and profound respect. I didn't catch Old Man Tiber, but I saw him. I felt his power. I knew that the legend was real. I reeled in the severed line, retrieving the broken end. As I examined it, I noticed something odd. The steel braid wasn't just cut. It was frayed almost, melted. It was as if something had burned through it with intense heat. I looked back towards the devil's elbow, a shiver running down my spine. Maybe Old Man Tiber was more than just a giant catfish. Maybe he was something else. I didn't fish the devil's elbow again for a long time. The memory of that encounter was too vivid, too unsettling. But the legend of Old Man Tiber never left me. Years later, I heard stories of other fishermen encountering him. Some claimed he was still guarding the depths of the Mississippi, a silent sentinel of the river. Others said he had moved on, seeking new territories, new waters to dominate. I don't know the truth, but I do know this. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to respect those mysteries and leave them undisturbed. As for the devil's elbow, well, it's still there, swirling and churning, a reminder of the day I came face to face with a legend. And every time I pass it, I can't help but wonder if old man Tiber is still lurking down there, waiting for the next unsuspecting fisherman to challenge his dominion. Y'all hang tight, I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. The salt hung thick in the air that day, just clinging to you like a second skin. I reckon it was late August, the kind where the sun beats down on the Gulf like a blacksmith's hammer, making the water shimmer and dance. Debbie, bless her heart, was back at the cabin, probably fussing over her begonias and getting ready for the next wave of travelers. I, on the other hand, was out there, me and my trusty boat, the Salty Dog, chasing the ever-elusive red drum. Now I've hooked a lot of red drum in my time, some real monsters, but this particular day felt different. It felt charged, like the air itself was humming with anticipation. I remember feeling an unusual calmness, a stillness that settled over me, like the morning mist over the bayou. Usually I'd be fidgeting, checking my lines, fussing with my bait, but that day I just let the boat drift, the rhythm of the waves rocking me into a peaceful trance. I wasn't using any fancy gear that day, just my old reliable rod, the one with the slightly worn cork grip, a simple weighted hook, and a chunk of fresh mullet. I've always been a believer in the power of simplicity, letting the fish do the talking, so to speak. Hours passed, and the sun started sinking, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A few smaller fish had nipped at my bait, but nothing of real interest. I was content, though, just enjoying the quiet solitude of the sea. Then it happened. The rod bent over like a willow in a hurricane. Not a sharp, jarring tug, but a slow, powerful pull, like something enormous had decided to explore the depths with my line. My heart jumped into my throat, and that calm I'd been feeling turned into a thrill that ran right down to my toes. I knew, in that instant, this was no ordinary fish. I set the hook, and the fight began, a battle of wills between man and beast that played out under the fading light. This wasn't a quick, erratic fight. It was slow, deliberate, the fish pulling me one way, me giving a little, then taking some line back. It felt like I was wrestling a submerged log, an ancient leviathan that had seen centuries of the ocean's secrets. Sweat beaded on my brow as I fought the fish. My arms ached. My back was screaming, but I couldn't give up. Not now. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. It was about something deeper, something primal. It was about the connection between a fisherman and the sea, a respect for the power that lay beneath the surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and I was fighting under the soft glow of the moon. The stars started to appear, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. I couldn't see the fish yet, but I could feel its immense power, its resilience. I started to think I might lose, but something deep inside me wouldn't let me quit. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a flash of silver in the moonlight, then another. I could make out the broad, powerful tail thrashing in the water as the fish broke the surface, its copper scales gleaming. It was the biggest red drum I'd ever seen, a true specimen, easily 70, maybe 80 pounds, maybe more. It looked like it could swallow my smallest dog whole. Slowly, carefully, I began to reel it in, the boat rocking with the strain. It was a delicate dance, a give and take, each movement calculated. I kept a steady hand, knowing that one wrong twitch could snap the line, or worse, break my heart. Finally, after what seemed like days, I managed to get the fish alongside the boat. I could see it clearly now, its big, soulful eye looking back at me. Now some might say I was foolish, but instead of pulling him aboard, something made me pause. I just stared at him, mesmerized. There he was, majestic and strong. I remember thinking about how many years he'd been swimming those currents, witnessing the ever-changing tides. I felt a profound respect for him, a kinship that went beyond the usual fisherman's pride. It was like I was seeing a part of myself reflected in his ancient eyes, a connection to the deeper rhythms of the universe that we all sometimes tend to forget. In that moment, the thrill of the catch faded. I knew that pulling him into the boat, taking him away from his home, just didn't feel right. So I did something I never usually do. I took my knife and carefully cut the line. I watched as the red drum paused for a moment, then, with a flick of its powerful tail, disappeared back into the darkness, sinking into the depths from whence he came. The line went slack, and the silence that followed felt both empty and profound. Now, most of the fellas from the docks would have called me a fool. They might have even laughed. Why would I release a fish like that? I could have bragged about it for years, but I didn't care. The memory of that encounter, that silent understanding between man and fish, was worth more than any trophy I could ever hang above my mantel. I pulled in my line, packed up my gear, and headed back to shore. Debbie was waiting for me, a worried look on her face, but I just smiled and told her, "I caught a big one, Debs, the biggest one I've ever seen." She asked how big in pounds, and I told her. "Oh dear," she said, "that would have been a great feast for the travelers." I just chuckled and said, "But this one, Debs, I'll remember forever." And you know what? I still remember it like it was yesterday. The salt, the sweat, the fight, the gentle release. That's the thing about fishing, friend. It's not just about the catch. It's about the journey. It's about the moments of quiet contemplation, the connection with nature, and sometimes it's about the ones that got away. And that, my friend, is a story I'll carry with me until the day the tide takes me away. Now, how about another glass of tea? I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. It was back in 82, maybe 83. Lord, time flies like gnats on a summer evening. I was still a young feller then, full of vinegar and the need to prove myself. My daddy, bless his soul, had taught me everything he knew about fishing the Gulf, but I was restless, always looking for something bigger, something legendary. The whispers started in the docks down in Biloxi. Fishermen talk, you know, always exaggerating, always trying to outdo each other. But this was different. This wasn't just tavern talk. This was hushed tones and nervous eyes. Talk of a monster grouper. They called him Old Leviathan. Now I'd caught my share of big grouper over the years. 100-pounders, maybe even a touch more. But this was different. They said Old Leviathan was different. They said he lived out past the continental shelf, in a spot where the water was dark as ink, and the pressure could crush a submarine. They said he was bigger than a Volkswagen, with eyes like dinner plates, and a mouth that could swallow a man whole. Most folks dismissed it as fisherman's lore, a tall tale spun to scare the tourists. But something about the way they talked about him, the fear in their voices, it stuck with me. It got under my skin like chiggers in July. I couldn't shake it, so I started doing my research. I pored over charts, studied the currents, talked to divers who'd gone out that far. Most just laughed in my face, told me I was chasing a ghost. But a few, the ones I trusted, they admitted they'd heard the rumors too. They'd seen things out there, strange readings on their sonar, unexplained shadows in the deep. I had a boat back then, a 28-foot Bertram, named her the Wanderer. She was a sturdy girl, built for the open water. I spent weeks getting her ready, reinforced the hull, upgraded the sonar, rigged up a heavy-duty winch that could haul a small car out of the ocean, and I started preparing my tackle. Now, you gotta understand, regular grouper fishing gear ain't gonna cut it with something like old Leviathan. I'm talking about thick braided line, strong enough to tow a truck, hooks forged from hardened steel, and a rod that felt like holding a telephone pole. I even had a custom-made lure built, a giant articulated sardine, painted with luminescent paint to attract attention in the deep. My wife, bless her heart, thought I was losing my mind. She'd say, "Jerry, you're going to get yourself killed chasing that fish. Leave it alone. It's just a story." But I couldn't. The idea of old Leviathan had burrowed its way into my soul. I had to know if he was real. Finally, the day came. The weather was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and a gentle breeze blowing off the Gulf. I packed the Wanderer with enough fuel, food, and water to last a week. I kissed my wife goodbye, told her I loved her, and pointed the Wanderer's bow towards the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun beat down, the engine hummed, and the water stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of blue. As I got further from shore, the other boats disappeared. It was just me, the Wanderer, and the open ocean. Then I hit the spot. The coordinates I'd painstakingly calculated from the charts and the divers' reports. The bottom dropped off sharply, plunging into what felt like another world. The water turned a deep, forbidding blue, almost black. The sonar screen lit up with jagged peaks and valleys, indicating a complex underwater landscape. I cut the engine and let the Wanderer drift. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the creak of the hull and the distant cries of gulls. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and lowered my line. The weight of the lure and the sinker pulled the line taut. It felt like I was lowering a small anchor. I watched the line spool out, counting the meters as they ticked off on the counter. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The water was getting colder, darker. Finally, at 300 meters, the line stopped. I was on the bottom. I engaged the reel and started jigging the lure, trying to attract some attention. I waited. Nothing. Just the feel of the current tugging at the line. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Doubt started to creep into my mind. Maybe my wife was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe old Leviathan was just a myth, but I couldn't give up. Not yet. I adjusted my position slightly and tried again. This time I let the lure sit on the bottom for a longer period, hoping to pique the interest of anything that might be lurking nearby. Then it happened. The rod bent double. It was like hitting a brick wall. The line screamed off the reel. I grabbed the rod with both hands, braced my feet against the deck, and held on for dear life. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, incredibly powerful. It was pulling the Wanderer sideways, like she was nothing more than a toy boat. I tightened the drag on the reel, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The line kept screaming out. My arms were aching, my back was burning, and my knuckles were white. I knew that if this thing kept running at this pace, I was going to get spooled, and once that line snapped, whatever was down there would be gone forever. I had to do something. Slowly, carefully, I started to gain some ground. Inch by inch, I cranked the reel, fighting against the immense weight and power on the other end. My muscles screamed in protest, but I refused to give in. For what felt like an eternity, it was a battle of wills. Me against this thing. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The air grew cooler, and the sea became even darker. Finally, after what felt like hours, I started to see some progress. The runs became shorter, the pulls less violent. I was gaining line. I knew I was getting close. Then I saw it. On the sonar screen, a massive shape appeared. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It dwarfed the Wanderer. It was old Leviathan. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I was also exhilarated. I had found him. The legend was real. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought him closer to the surface. The strain on the line was incredible. I could feel the heat of the reel burning against my fingers. Then he broke the surface. The sight of him took my breath away. He was enormous. His body was a mottled brown and gray, covered in barnacles and scars. His eyes were huge, like ancient knowing orbs. His mouth was a cavernous maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. He looked at me, or at least I thought he did. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I felt a connection, a sense of awe and respect. This was an ancient creature, a survivor. He had seen things I couldn't even imagine. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, me and old Leviathan. Then he did something unexpected. He just stopped fighting. He hung there, suspended in the water, his massive body barely moving. I loosened the drag on the reel and let him rest. I knew that I could probably reel him in, get him close enough to the boat to take a picture, maybe even try to tag him. But something told me not to. I looked at him, at his ancient eyes, at his scarred body. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to conquer him. I just needed to know that he was real. So I did the only thing that felt right. I cut the line. The lure, the hook, the leader, all drifted away, sinking back into the depths. Old Leviathan turned slowly and disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty ocean. The sun had set completely, and the stars had started to come out. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the Wanderer. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found what I was looking for, not in the fish itself, but in the journey, in the challenge, in the knowledge that there are still mysteries out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean. I started the engine and turned the Wanderer towards home. The journey back was long and uneventful, but I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen old Leviathan, and I had learned something about myself in the process. I never told anyone the full story. Most folks wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have said I was crazy or lying or just plain old making it up. But that's all right. The memory is enough. It's a story that only I know the full truth of. The Wanderer's hull had some damage over the years and ended up being sold for scraps, but it all paid off. That fishing adventure gave me a lifetime worth of stories to tell. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. Hurricanes, they're a fact of life down here on the Gulf Coast. You learn to respect them, you learn to watch the signs, and you learn to get the heck out of Dodge when they come calling. Most of the time, you get a good few days warning, plenty of time to haul your boat up on blocks, batten down the hatches, and hunker down with some iced tea and wait it out. But this one wasn't like that. This one blew in like a runaway train, sneaky like a thief in the night, and nearly stole my life. It did. It was back, it must have been 98, maybe 99. Can't rightly remember the year, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. Summer was in full swing, hotter than blue blazes, the kind of heat that hangs heavy in the air, makes the cicadas sing louder and slower, and just saps the energy right out of you. But the fishing was good. Oh, Lordy, was it good. Red snapper were biting like crazy, and I was bringing in my limit every trip. Enough to keep the freezer full, sell a bit to old Mrs. Henderson down at the fish market, and still have some left over to share with my neighbors. A good summer, a real good summer. That morning started just like any other. Woke up before the sun. That's the fisherman's way, you know. Got to beat the heat and beat the crowds. Made myself a strong cup of coffee, black as sin and hot as the hinges of hell, and a couple of slices of toast with some homemade fig, preserves my wife, bless her soul, used to make. She's been gone, well, a good long while now, but her preserves, they still sweeten my mornings. Hopped in my old Ford pickup, that trusty beast, and drove down to the marina. The Salty Dog, that's what I called my boat. A 22-foot Grady White she was. Not fancy, not new, but solid as a rock and seaworthy as they come. She'd seen me through a lot, that boat. We were partners, me and the Salty Dog. Always looked after each other. Got down to the dock. The air was still cool then, just starting to get that humid edge to it. The sky was clear as a bell, not a cloud in sight. Sun just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sea was flat calm, like a sheet of glass reflecting the dawn. Perfect fishing weather. Couldn't have asked for better. I untied her lines, fired up the engine, that old reliable purr, and idled out of the no-wake zone. Headed out towards my favorite snapper spot, about 30 miles offshore. Out there you get away from the crowds, and the fish are always bigger, tastier too, I swear. The trip out was smooth as butter, just the gentle rocking of the boat, the smell of salt air, and the sound of the engine humming. Seagulls crying overhead, dolphins playing in the wake. Days like that, you feel like you're living in a postcard, like nothing could ever go wrong. Got to my spot, dropped anchor, and got to work. Baited my hooks with some squid, dropped my lines, and bam, almost instant bite. Pulled up a nice chunky red snapper, bright red and feisty as could be. Grinned like a fool. This was going to be a good day, I thought. And it was for a while. Fish were jumping in the boat. The sun was climbing higher, warming my back, and I was whistling along to some old country tune on the radio. Felt like I was on top of the world. Had about half my limit in the cooler already, and it wasn't even 10 in the morning. Then things started to change. Subtle at first, like a whisper in the wind before the storm. I noticed the wind picking up a little. Just a slight breeze, hardly anything to worry about. But it felt different, colder somehow, and it shifted direction. Started coming from the north, which was unusual for that time of year. Normally the summer winds blow in off the Gulf, warm and moist. Looked up at the sky, still blue overhead, but towards the north, over the land. There was a haze starting to gather, kind of a grayish, yellowish haze. Didn't look like rain clouds, not yet. More like something brewing. Ignored it for a bit. Figured it was just some afternoon thunderstorms rolling in early. Happens sometimes, but the wind kept picking up, and the haze was getting thicker, darker. The sea, which had been so calm, started to get a little chop to it. Just little whitecaps, but still. The radio started acting funny, static creeping in, drowning out the music. Tried switching channels, see if I could get a weather report. Nothing but static and garbled voices. That's when a little prickle of unease started to creep up my spine. Then the birds went quiet. Seagulls stopped crying, just disappeared. Dolphins vanished too. The whole ocean seemed to hold its breath. And the wind. Lord, that wind was starting to howl now. No longer a breeze. This was a proper wind, pushing the boat around, making it harder to hold my position. Looked up at the sky again. The haze had swallowed up the blue. The whole sky was this sickly gray-yellow color now, and it was moving fast, rushing in from the north like a freight train. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a thunderstorm. This was something else, something bad. Hurricane, I said out loud to myself, the word catching in my throat. Couldn't believe it. Hurricanes don't just pop up like this, not without warning. We always get days to prepare. But looking at that sky, feeling that wind, I knew, in my gut, this was a hurricane, and it was coming right for me. Panic started to set in. But I pushed it down. Years of fishing, years of dealing with rough seas, kicked in. Had to stay calm, had to think. First thing, haul anchor. Couldn't stay anchored in this. Boat would get swamped for sure. Started cranking that anchor winch. Wind was screaming now, rain starting to spit, stinging my face. Waves were getting bigger, choppier, tossing the boat around. Like a cork. Took forever to get that anchor up, felt like. Every muscle in my arms screaming. Finally got it aboard, stowed it as best I could, and scrambled back to the helm. Engine roaring now. Pointed the boat into the wind, trying to keep her steady. Needed to head back to shore, and fast. But shore felt 1,000,000 miles away. The storm hit then, not gradually. Not with a slow build-up, just bam, like a giant fist slamming down on the ocean. Wall of rain hit first, blinding, torrential. Couldn't see a thing. Then the wind, a solid wall of air, like hitting a brick wall at full speed. Knocked the breath right out of me. Waves exploded around the boat, huge monstrous things, rising up like mountains, then crashing down with a roar. The salty dog was tossed around like a toy, Up one wave, down another, sideways, every which way, but loose. Lost all sense of direction. Just hanging on for dear life, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, fighting to keep the boat pointed into the waves. Engine screaming, straining, but barely making headway against the wind and waves. Rain was coming down so hard, it was like being underwater, even above deck. Couldn't see, couldn't hear, just the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and the shuddering of the boat. Thought for sure she was going to break apart. Right then and there. Waves kept getting bigger, meaner. 1 minute I was staring up at a wall of water 20 feet high. The next I was plunging down into a trough so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Water was pouring over the sides, filling the cockpit. Bilge pump was working overtime, but it was a losing battle. Tried to call for help on the radio again, but it was useless. Just static and crackling. Lost contact with everyone. Alone out there in the middle of the storm. Just me and the salty dog against the full fury of nature. Time lost all meaning. Could have been hours. Could have been minutes. Felt like an eternity. Just fighting, struggling, trying to survive. Every wave felt like it was going to be the one to flip the boat, to send me to the bottom. Fear was a constant companion, gnawing at my insides, whispering that this was the end. Remember looking out through the driving rain and seeing something big and dark looming through the waves. Thought it was another monstrous wave, but then it got closer, and I realized it was a ship, a big cargo ship, wallowing in the storm, just as helpless as I was, but a whole lot bigger. Scared me even more seeing that thing. Made me realize just how small I was, how insignificant, out here in the face of this storm, like an ant facing a bulldozer. Kept fighting, kept trying to steer, kept pumping the bilge, kept praying, prayed to God, prayed to my wife, prayed to anyone who might be listening, just begging for it to stop, begging for a break. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to ease. Wind didn't howl quite so loud. Rain didn't fall quite so hard. Waves, still big, still rough, but not quite so monstrous. Like the storm was taking a breath. Held my breath too, not daring to believe it. But it kept easing. Wind died down a bit more. Rain turned to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. Clouds started to break up, and through the gaps I saw blue sky. Just patches of it, but blue sky nonetheless. Sun even peeked through for a moment, weak and watery. But still, the sun. Felt like I hadn't seen the sun in days. Or maybe it had only been hours. Didn't matter. The storm was passing. The sea was still a mess. Waves still big and confused. But the worst was over. Engine was still running, thank God. Boat was battered, bruised, cockpit full of water, but she was afloat. We'd made it. We'd survived. Sat there for a long time after the storm passed, just catching my breath, letting the adrenaline drain away, shaking like a leaf, cold and wet and exhausted, but alive. That was all that mattered. Alive. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the salty dog toward shore. Trip back was slow, careful. Waves were still kicking up, and the boat was riding low with all the water in it. But the sun was coming out stronger now, warming my face, drying my clothes. Saw other boats out there, coming out of hiding, blinking in the sunlight like newborn calves. Everyone looking around, taking stock of the damage, the aftermath. We'd all been through it. We'd all survived. Finally limped back into port. Folks were there on the docks, waiting, worried, sick. Saw my buddy, old Billy, waving his arms, yelling my name. He ran down as I tied up, face all pale and drawn. "Jerry, you all right? We thought you were a goner." I just grinned, weak and shaky, and said, "Like a bad penny, Billy. Always turn up again." He slapped me on the back, hard enough to make me cough, but it felt good. Felt good to be back on solid ground, felt good to be alive, felt good to be among friends. Later we found out what happened. That storm, they called it a freak storm, formed out of nowhere, strengthened over warm water in record time, and slammed into the coast with hardly any warning. Caught everyone by surprise. Some folks weren't so lucky. Lost boats, lost homes. Some even lost their lives. But me and the salty dog, we made it. Learned a lesson that day, let me tell you. Respect the sea. Always respect the sea. You think you know it. You think you've seen it all. And then something like that comes along and reminds you just how small you really are. Still go fishing, you know. Can't keep an old fisherman away from the water. But I'm a whole lot more careful now. I watch the skies. I listen to the weather reports. And if there's even a whisper of trouble, I head for shore. Ain't no fish worth going through that again. Not for all the tea in China. Hope you're ready, 'cause this next story's got a pull to it. Just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. It must have been, late 80s, maybe early 90s. Yeah, early 90s, I reckon. I was younger then, of course. Stronger, quicker. Still had all my hair then, too, though it was probably already starting to think about turning gray. Debbie and I, we were just getting settled into this place, and I was fishing like a man possessed. Didn't have the responsibility of running the cabin back then. Just me, the boat, and the open water. Pure freedom, that was. Now, you got to understand, back then, the fishing was different. Not better, not worse, just different. Regulations weren't as tight, and the fish, well, they seemed a little bigger, a little bolder maybe. Or maybe it was just me being younger and thinking everything was bigger back then. Could be that too. Anyway, I had this boat back then, a 23-foot Grady White. She was a beauty, that boat. The salty dog, I called her. Solid as a rock. Could handle anything the Gulf threw at her. I spent more time on that boat than I did on dry land some weeks, I swear. Used to head out before sunrise, come back long after dark, sometimes even stay out overnight if the fishing was good. Debbie, she'd worry herself sick sometimes, but she knew it was in my blood. Fishing, that is. It's more than just a hobby for me. It's part of who I am, like breathing air or feeling the sun on your face. So this particular trip, I was heading out for grouper. Now grouper, they're a bottom fish. Big, strong, delicious eating, and a real challenge to catch. They live down deep, around reefs and wrecks, anywhere they can find cover. They're ambush predators, you see. Lurk in the shadows, wait for a tasty snack to swim by, and then bam, they're on it. And once they're hooked, they'll head straight back down into their hole, try to break you off on the rocks or the wreck. You gotta be quick, gotta be strong, and gotta be smart to catch a big grouper. I had a spot I'd been fishing for years, about 30 miles offshore, an old sunken shrimp boat, down in maybe 80 feet of water. I'd caught some good fish there before, but nothing prepared me for what was waiting for me that day. The morning dawned crisp and clear, just the way I like it. Sunrise painting the sky in oranges and pinks. The air still cool and salty. The Gulf was almost flat calm, just a gentle swell rolling in. Perfect grouper weather, as we say. I had my gear all loaded up, my favorite heavy tackle rod and reel, spooled with strong braided line, and a cooler full of ice and bait. Mullet was the bait of choice that day. Nice and oily. Grouper can't resist it. I got out to the spot just as the sun was climbing above the horizon. Used my GPS, fancy stuff for back then, but it was a lifesaver, to pinpoint the wreck. Dropped anchor up current, letting the boat drift back over the spot. I like to fish with live bait when I can, but mullet chunks work just fine too, especially for grouper. I rigged up a heavy jig head, hooked a nice chunk of mullet on it, and dropped it down. Now, grouper fishing. It's not like trolling for mackerel or casting for redfish. It's mostly waiting. You drop your bait down, let it sink to the bottom, and then you just wait. Feel for the bite. Sometimes it's a subtle tap, tap, tap. Other times it's like a freight train hitting your line. You never really know. I let my bait sink down, felt it thud against the bottom. Reeled up a couple of cranks to keep it just off the seabed, and then I waited. The gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the cries of the gulls overhead. It's a peaceful sort of waiting. Let you clear your head, think about things, or not think about anything at all. Just be present in the moment. After maybe 10 minutes, I felt a little twitch on my line, just a tiny little tug, like a nibble. Could have been a small snapper, could have been a trigger fish, could have been anything. I ignored it. Sometimes those little fish just mess with your bait. You gotta wait for the real deal. Then a few minutes later, another twitch. This time, a bit more insistent, like something was sniffing around, getting interested. My heart started to beat a little faster. Grouper? Maybe. Just maybe. I held my breath, my hand gripping the rod tight, feeling every vibration of the line. And then it happened. Wham! It was like the bottom of the ocean just exploded. The rod bent over double. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. This wasn't no little snapper. This was something big. Real big. Whoa! I yelled out loud, more to myself than anything else. Hang on tight, Jerry. The fish was pulling drag like crazy, heading straight down towards the wreck. I knew what it was trying to do. It was trying to get back into its hole, to rub the line against the sharp edges of the wreckage and break me off. If it made it down there, it would be game over. I tightened the drag on my reel as much as I dared. Didn't want to break the line, but I couldn't let it get down to the wreck either. It was a delicate balance. The rod was bowed almost to the breaking point. My arms were straining, my knuckles white as bone. This fish was strong, unbelievably strong. Stronger than any grouper I'd ever tangled with before, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. It was a straight up and down battle. Me against the fish, brute strength against brute strength. I was slowly, agonizingly gaining line. Inch by inch, foot by foot, I was pulling it up from the depths. But every foot I gained, it felt like it fought me back with two. My arms were burning, my back was aching, sweat was pouring down my face, even in the cool morning air. But I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not with a fish like this on the line. This was the kind of fish you dream about, the kind of fish that makes all those hours of waiting, all those empty trips, all worthwhile. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the screaming of the reel started to slow. The line angle started to change, pointing more towards the surface. I was gaining ground. I could feel the fish tiring just a little. Or maybe it was me who was tiring. I couldn't tell anymore. I kept pumping and reeling, slowly but surely bringing the fish up. My muscles were screaming. My hands were cramping, but adrenaline was coursing through my veins, keeping me going. I had to see this fish. I had to know what was on the end of that line. And then it started, a faint shimmer, deep down in the green water, a flash of white, and then slowly, majestically it began to rise. Bigger and bigger it grew as it came up from the depths. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary grouper. This was a monster. It broke the surface with a swirl of white water, and I finally got my first real look at it. It was a gag grouper, and it was enormous, bigger than any grouper I had ever seen or even heard of. Its body was thick as a barrel, its mouth like a bucket, its eyes cold and ancient. It looked like something out of a prehistoric age. I just stared at it, awestruck. For a moment, I almost forgot I was still hooked up to it. It was just magnificent, truly magnificent. But the fight wasn't over yet. The fish was still plenty strong, and it was still angry. It thrashed at the surface, sending spray flying, trying to shake the hook. I knew I had to get it alongside the boat, and fast, before it found a second wind, or before the hook pulled loose. Slowly, carefully, I worked it towards the boat. It was like trying to maneuver a small truck. Every move was deliberate. Every inch gained was hard fought. Finally, after what seemed like another eternity, I had it alongside. And that's when I realized I didn't have a net big enough. I didn't have a gaff big enough. Heck, I probably didn't have anything on board that was big enough to handle this fish. I was in trouble. I circled the fish, trying to figure out what to do. It was just lying there on the surface, its massive gills pumping, its dark eyes staring at me. It was exhausted, just like I was, but I knew it could still summon up a last burst of energy if it needed to. Then I had an idea, a crazy idea maybe, but it was the only one I had. I grabbed my heavy leader material, the stuff I used to make my bottom rigs, and tied a loop in the end, a big, strong loop. Then carefully, slowly, I leaned over the side of the boat, my heart pounding in my throat. I had to get that loop around the fish's tail. That was the only way I was going to get it into the boat. But getting close enough to that monstrous mouth, well, it made my skin crawl just thinking about it. Taking a deep breath, I reached out with the loop. The fish didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was like it knew what I was trying to do. Slowly, carefully, inch by inch, I maneuvered the loop toward its tail. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the loop around its tail. Gently, I tightened it. Snug, but not too tight. I didn't want to hurt the fish, and I didn't want to spook it. Then, with a grunt and every ounce of strength I had left, I started to haul. It was like trying to lift a bag of cement out of the water. My muscles screamed. My back protested. My arms felt like they were going to rip out of their sockets. But I kept pulling. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to lift the fish's tail out of the water, then its body, then its massive head. It was a struggle, a desperate back-breaking struggle, but I was winning. Finally, with a last Herculean heave, I managed to swing the fish up and over the gunwale of the boat. It landed on the deck with a thud that shook the whole boat. And then it was done. It was in the boat. I had done it. I collapsed back against the console, gasping for breath, my body trembling, my hands shaking. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the fish, at this magnificent creature I had just wrestled from the depths. It was even bigger on deck than it had looked in the water. Truly a monster. After a few minutes, when my breathing started to return to normal, I got up and went over to the fish. It was still alive, its gills still pumping, but it was exhausted just like I was. I knelt down beside it and just looked at it, really looked at it, at its thick, powerful body, its ancient eyes, its massive mouth. It was a creature of the deep, a king of its domain, and I had, for a brief moment, matched wits with it and come out on top. A strange feeling washed over me. Pride, of course, but also respect and a little bit of sadness. Sadness that such a magnificent creature was now out of its element, out of its world. Sadness that its life, which had probably spanned decades, maybe even centuries, was now going to end. I knew I couldn't release it, not after such a long fight. It was too exhausted, too stressed. It wouldn't survive. And besides, back then, regulations weren't what they are now. Catching a fish like this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a trophy, a story to tell for years to come. So with a heavy heart, but with a sense of awe and respect, I dispatched the grouper. It was quick and as humane as I could make it. Then I set about the task of getting it into the fish box. Even that was a struggle. It barely fit. I had to really cram it in there, and even then the tail was sticking out. The trip back to shore was, well, it was different. The boat felt heavier, more solid somehow, like it was carrying something truly significant. The sun was higher now. The day was getting hotter, but I hardly noticed. My mind was still back there in the depths, battling that fish. When I got back to the dock, there were a few other fishermen around, cleaning their catches. As I pulled up, they all stopped what they were doing and stared. They saw the size of the fish in my boat, and their jaws just dropped. "Holy moly, Jerry, what in the world did you catch?" one of them asked, his eyes wide. "Grouper," I said, my voice still a little hoarse from yelling. "A big one." They came over to take a look, and a small crowd started to gather. Everyone was amazed. They'd never seen a grouper that big, never even heard of one that big. Word spread around the docks like wildfire. People came from all over, just to see it. We weighed it on the dock scales. It tipped the scales at, well, let's just say it was well over 100 pounds. Closer to 150 if I'm being honest. A true monster grouper. That fish, well, it fed us for weeks, and we shared it with all our friends and neighbors. It was the talk of the town for months. People still ask me about it sometimes, even now. "Jerry, remember that giant grouper you caught back in the day?" They always ask. And I always smile and say, "Yeah, I remember." How could I forget? Because you don't forget a fish like that. It's not just about the size, although that was impressive, sure. It's about the fight, the struggle, the connection you make with nature, with the raw power of the ocean. All right now, enough waiting around. Let's drop our lines and see where this next story takes us. Ah, yes, there was that time down on the Black River back in, oh lordy, must have been around 88, maybe 89. Time flies faster than a hummingbird in heat, I'm telling you. Now the Black River, beautiful place it is, or was back then. Still pretty now, I reckon, but different. Things always change, don't they? Anyway, back then, the Black River was wilder, less touched, you could say, especially down past the old paper mill. Now that paper mill, that's important to this story. It wasn't the cleanest operation, not by a long shot. They used to dump all sorts of, well, let's just say things you wouldn't want swimming in, right into the river. Folks around here, we knew it, but back then, nobody said much. Jobs were jobs, you know. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and keep fishing. And fish I did. Black River catfish were legendary. Big, meaty, tasty. Well, most of them were. I had my favorite spot, a little bend in the river, about 3 miles downstream from the mill. Deep hole there, with a big old cypress tree leaning over the water, roots all tangled in the bank. Perfect catfish hangout. I used to go there every chance I got, early mornings mostly, when the river was still misty and quiet, just the sound of the water and the birds waking up. Peaceful, calm, just what an old fisherman needs. Now usually, I'd catch your regular run-of-the-mill catfish there. Blues, channels, maybe a flathead if I was lucky. Good size, maybe a couple of pounds to 10, 15 on a really good day. Enough for supper, and maybe a little extra to sell down at the market. But one day was different. It was a day just like today, actually. Warm, sunny, little breeze kicking up. I got to my spot just as the sun was peeking over the trees, making the river sparkle like it was sprinkled with diamonds. Perfect fishing weather, I thought to myself. I baited up my line with some chicken liver. Catfish just can't resist that stuff, and cast it out into the deep hole under that cypress. And I waited. Now fishing ain't just about catching fish, you know. It's about the waiting, the thinking, the watching the world go by. It's therapy, pure and simple. Just me, the river, and the quiet of nature. I was leaning back against that cypress, closing my eyes, just listening to the river gurgle by, when bam, my pole nearly jumped right out of my hands. Now, I've had big catfish hit my line before, but this was different. This wasn't no gentle tug. This was like hooking into a runaway train. My reel was screaming, line peeling off like it was on fire. I grabbed that pole tight, braced myself against the bank, and set the hook hard. Whatever was on the other end of that line, it was big, really big. The fight was on, and boy, what a fight it was. This fish pulled and tugged, dove deep, ran sideways, everything it could to get away. It was like fighting an underwater tractor. I'm telling you, my arms were aching, my back was creaking, sweat was beading up on my forehead. But I wasn't about to give up, not after a hit like that. I've been fishing too long to back down from a challenge. Now usually, when you're fighting a big fish, you can kind of feel what it is. The way it pulls, the way it shakes its head. You get a sense of whether it's a catfish, a bass, a carp, whatever. But this was something else. It felt different, heavier, stronger, angrier somehow. And the longer I fought it, the more uneasy I started to feel. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 20 minutes, I started to gain some ground. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to crank that reel, pulling the fish up from the depths. And then I saw it. It surfaced about 50 feet out, thrashing and splashing like a wounded whale. And that's when I got my first good look at it. And let me tell you, my jaw nearly dropped to the riverbank. It was a catfish, all right. No doubt about that. But it wasn't like any catfish I'd ever seen in my life. This thing was, well, it was glowing. Not like a light bulb, mind you, but a faint, greenish, sickly sort of glow, especially around its whiskers and its fins and its eyes. Lord have mercy. Its eyes were like two red coals burning in the murky water. And the size of it, it was huge. I mean, truly monstrous. I reckon it was at least 4 feet long, maybe 5, and as thick as a log. Its skin wasn't the usual catfish color either. It was patchy, almost like it was molting, with these strange, pale, almost translucent areas mixed in with the normal dark brown. And it had growths, lumpy, fleshy growths all along its back and sides, looking like tumors or something. It was something straight out of a horror movie, I tell you. Wasn't the Sam Hill, I muttered to myself, reeling it in closer, but now a lot slower, a lot more cautious. I was no longer thinking about supper. Now I was just thinking about survival. This wasn't no ordinary fish. This was something else entirely. As I got it closer to the bank, I could smell it. A strange, metallic, almost chemical smell, mixed with the usual fishy river scent. And I started to put two and two together. The paper mill, the strange glow, the growths, the size. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a big catfish. This was a mutant, a radioactive mutant, most likely, thanks to all that stuff they were dumping in the river upstream. Now, I'm no scientist. I'm just a simple fisherman, but I knew enough to know that radiation ain't good. And this fish, well, it looked like it had been marinating in the stuff for years. My heart started thumping in my chest like a drum solo. Fear, real fear, started to creep into my bones. But you know what? Underneath the fear, there was also curiosity. Yeah, curious. I know, sounds crazy, right? Here I am, face to face with some kind of glow-in-the-dark monster fish, and I'm curious. But that's just how I am, I guess. Always been a bit of a curious soul, and maybe a little bit reckless too, or maybe just plain foolish. Take your pick. Anyway, I got it right up to the edge of the bank. It was still thrashing weakly, its red eyes glaring up at me. I could see its teeth now, long and sharp, looking like they could bite right through a steel cable. I knew I couldn't bring it in the boat. No way. That thing was too dangerous, too unnatural. So, what did I do? Well, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for my pliers, the ones I always carry to unhook fish, and I decided I was going to cut the line. Let it go. Let it go back to whatever dark radioactive depths it came from. Some fish just ain't meant to be caught. And this was definitely one of them. But just as I was about to cut the line, something happened. The fish, it stopped thrashing. It just went still. And its red eyes, they seemed to soften somehow, almost like it was looking at me. Not in an angry way, but almost like it was asking for help. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jerry, you imagine things. It's just a fish. But I swear to you, son, that's what it felt like. It felt like this mutant catfish, this creature of the radioactive river, was looking at me with understanding, with maybe even a little bit of sadness. And in that moment, something changed in me. The fear, it faded away, replaced by, well, by pity, I guess, and maybe a little bit of guilt. Guilt that we humans, we had done this to this creature, turned it into this freak of nature. So I didn't cut the line. Instead, I did something even crazier. I gently, carefully reached down and unhooked it. Yeah, I know, sounds insane. Reaching down and unhooking a glowing mutant radioactive catfish. But I did it. Slowly, calmly, just like I was unhooking any other fish. Except this time my hands were shaking like leaves in a hurricane. And you know what? It let me. It didn't bite, didn't thrash, didn't even move. It just lay there, still as a stone, while I worked the hook free. And when I finally got it out, I just let go of the line and watched. The catfish, it just lay there for a moment, floating in the water. Then, slowly, almost deliberately, it turned its head and looked at me one more time. Those red eyes, they seemed to flicker like a dying ember. And then, with a slow, powerful flick of its tail, it vanished, sunk back down into the dark depths of the Black River. Gone. I stood there for a long time, watching the ripples fade away, just trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had I imagined it? Had it been a hallucination, brought on by the sun and the heat? Or had I really just wrestled with, and then released, a radioactive mutant catfish? I don't know for sure. Maybe it was just the biggest catfish I ever caught, and my mind just played tricks on me, made it into something it wasn't. But I don't think so. I think deep down, I know what I saw that day, and I know why I let it go. I packed up my gear that day and walked back to my truck, a lot quieter than when I'd arrived. Didn't catch another fish that day. Didn't even want to. Just drove home and sat on this porch, just like I'm sitting now, looking out at the lake and thinking. I never went back to that spot on the Black River. Not after that. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that catfish. Is it still down there, glowing in the dark, getting bigger and stranger with each passing year? Or did it not make it? Did the radiation finally catch up to it? I don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Some things are best left a mystery. But I'll tell you one thing, son. That day on the Black River, it changed me. Made me think differently about things. About the river. About the fish. About us. About what we do to this world. And what it does to us in return. So, there you have it. The tale of the radioactive mutant catfish of the Black River. A true story? Well, that's for you to decide. But I swear, every word of it is as true as I remember it. And in the end, maybe that's all that matters, eh? The memory of it, the feeling of it, the lesson of it, maybe. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.